In less than 48 hours, over 200 containers of American cheese, worth nearly $3 billion, were abruptly rejected at the Canadian border and sent back to the United States. Cheese, butter, and milk that had been carefully produced, packaged, and shipped for export suddenly became commercial waste. Imagine trucks full of dairy, stacked high with products, simply turned away. A stark visual of money, labor, and resources going down the drain. This isn't just a minor trade disagreement. This is a massive shockwave hitting the American food supply chain. Farmers who rely on international buyers are seeing their hard work instantly devalued. Storage facilities are overflowing, retailers are forced to scramble, and everyday consumers, people just trying to buy groceries, are unknowingly caught in the middle of a high-stakes economic battle. Think of it like a perfect storm. On one side, you have farmers with milk they can't sell. On the other, trucks and warehouses bursting with products that suddenly can't move. And in the middle are consumers, seeing discounted cheese in stores, unaware that it's part of a rejected shipment, near expiration, and previously turned away by foreign markets. To understand why Canada rejected so much American cheese, we need to look at the rules behind the trade. Canada operates a strict supply management system for dairy, beef, and poultry, a system that controls how much can be produced, imported, and sold. This isn't new. It's been in place since the 1960s, designed to protect Canadian farmers and keep prices stable. Under the USMCA trade agreement, the United States is allowed to export up to 3.6% of Canada's dairy market without triggering penalties. That may sound small, but even a few extra shipments beyond that limit can trigger massive tariffs. And that's exactly what happened. So, in July 2025, the U.S. dairy industry experienced an unprecedented shock. Hundreds of containers of American cheese, butter, and milk, worth nearly $3 billion, were abruptly turned away at the Canadian border. The trigger? Well, it was a 300% tariff that kicked in the moment U.S. exports exceeded Canada's strict USMCA quota of 3.6%. Just imagine trucks stacked high with cheese traveling thousands of miles, only to be stopped at the border, their contents suddenly deemed uncompetitive overnight. For farmers who had invested months of work, from feeding cows to processing milk into cheese, this wasn't just a financial setback. It was a direct blow to their livelihoods. The situation, honestly, was made even worse by the condition of the dairy itself. Much of the rejected stock was already near expiration, and some had actually been turned away by other international buyers before. Even high-quality specialty cheeses, like Italian-style varieties made in the U.S., were swept up in the tariff net. With duties at 300%, these containers were basically worthless for export. The price would have had to triple just to reach the Canadian market. Billions of dollars in dairy instantly became commercial waste. Trucks sat idle, warehouses overflowed, and the visual of stacked cheese crates became a stark reminder of lost labor, capital, and opportunity. The fallout, honestly, rippled quickly across the U.S. Family-run farms and mid-sized producers, already operating on really tight margins, suddenly faced catastrophic losses. Storage facilities were completely overwhelmed. Shipping companies struggled to reroute or hold containers, and workers had to confront the reality of months of effort just gone to waste. In states like Wisconsin and California, the heart of American dairy production, farms teetered right on the edge of financial collapse. What started as a simple quota breach became a cascading crisis. Rejected exports, stalled supply chains, and billions in losses threatening not just individual farmers, but really the stability of the entire U.S. dairy industry. Once the rejected shipments returned to the United States, the fallout became, well, impossible to ignore. Supermarkets and wholesale distributors suddenly found themselves flooded with cheese, butter, and milk that Canada had refused. To move these products, retailers like Walmart, Target, and Kroger slashed prices, creating the illusion of bargains for consumers. But behind those bright discount labels was a sobering reality. This wasn't ordinary stock on sale. It was dairy that had been rejected internationally, much of it already nearing expiration. The U.S. market, for a brief moment, became the final dumping ground for products the rest of the world had basically deemed unfit or surplus. For farmers, the return of these shipments was just devastating. Milk that had been turned into cheese or butter with months of labor and feed costs now had no buyer willing to pay a fair price. In Wisconsin, California, and other dairy-heavy states, farmers were forced to dump milk down the drain, a haunting image of waste and desperation. Family-run farms, some operating for generations, faced the grim choice of absorbing financial losses or shutting down entirely. The surplus wasn't just a market inconvenience, it was a human tragedy unfolding quietly in barns, warehouses, and processing plants across the country. The influx of rejected Canadian-bound dairy triggered a retail price war unlike anything seen before. Stores raced to liquidate stock, driving prices so low that even profitable sales became impossible. Cold storage facilities reached capacity, shipping costs just skyrocketed, and warehouses overflowed with surplus products. The supply chain was in chaos, not because demand had increased, but because the market had been forced to absorb products that were never intended to stay. Consumers saw cheap cheese on shelves, but the underlying story was a collapsing system, a domino effect of tariffs, overproduction, and regulatory gaps. While the headlines might have sounded dramatic, it's important to separate fact from exaggeration. President Donald Trump repeatedly highlighted Canada's dairy tariffs, claiming they reached 300%. And in this case, those numbers are accurate. The tariffs on American cheese, butter, and milk that exceeded Canada's USMCA quota were indeed set at nearly 300%, instantly making exports uncompetitive. This isn't political spin. It's the reality of the rules governing cross-border trade. At the same time, many Americans don't realize that when these products returned to the United States, they effectively became the final dumping ground for goods the international market had already rejected. What looks like a bargain on a store shelf is often near-expired cheese or butter that had no other buyer. The discrepancy between perception and reality is stark. Shoppers believe they are scoring deals, while farmers, distributors, and the supply chain are absorbing massive losses. Understanding this distinction is crucial, because it shows that this crisis isn't just about pricing or political rhetoric. It's about a misalignment between production, trade policy, and consumer awareness. By clarifying the facts, we can see the larger picture. Canadian tariffs, U.S. quota overages, and returning shipments combine to create a domestic impact that most Americans never expected. Consumers see cheap cheese, but behind it is a tangled web of trade rules, rejected exports, and financial fallout that threatens the stability of the American dairy industry. Canada's dairy system has been tightly controlled since the 1960s through a supply management framework designed to protect domestic farmers and ensure stable prices. Under this system, production quotas, tariffs, and import restrictions regulate how much milk, cheese, and butter can be produced and brought into the country. Programs like ProAction enforce strict quality standards, banning hormones such as RBST and requiring antibiotic testing for every batch of milk. Canadian farms also use traceability systems to ensure every shipment is safe, hormone-free, and ethically produced. These policies create a highly controlled environment that allows Canadian farmers to maintain predictable incomes and high-quality products. In contrast, the United States has far fewer restrictions, and many farms operate under looser regulatory oversight. This difference means that when U.S. dairy products attempt to enter Canada beyond the allowed quota, they face severe penalties like 300% tariffs, which instantly turn shipments into commercial waste. Understanding this system helps explain why Canada acted so decisively when the quota was exceeded and why the U.S. dairy industry was hit so hard. It's not arbitrary. It's the result of decades of carefully constructed policy designed to protect domestic production and control market stability. The tariff shock and return shipments have had devastating effects on American farmers. In Wisconsin, California, and other dairy-heavy states, family-run farms have been hit hardest. Many are facing plummeting milk prices as surplus products flood the domestic market, forcing some to dump milk down the drain simply because there's no buyer. According to industry reports, the U.S. dairy sector has already suffered billions in losses, with small and mid-sized farms struggling to survive. For farmers, this isn't just a financial issue, it's personal. Generations of family labor, livestock care, and production planning are suddenly devalued. Workers on these farms, too, face uncertainty as companies try to manage the unexpected surplus. Beyond individual farms, the broader economic impact spreads to local economies, suppliers, and transport companies tied to the dairy industry. The ripple effects are enormous, showing that a trade dispute on paper translates into very real hardship on the ground, and a national industry that many Americans take for granted is suddenly under severe stress. The rejected exports and surplus dairy have caused a full-blown supply chain crisis in the United States, Warehouses and cold storage facilities are just overflowing with cheese, butter, and milk that can't move fast enough to retailers. Shipping companies, are struggling to reroute or store products, and storage fees are climbing by the day. Major grocery chains, including Walmart, Target, and Kroger, have been forced into price wars, liquidating stock at steep discounts simply to clear inventory, not to meet consumer demand. The illusion of bargains masks the underlying chaos. Products are being sold at losses, and farmers and distributors are left absorbing the financial shock. This chain reaction shows how a single policy enforcement, in this case, Canada's 300% tariff, can cascade across the entire supply chain, affecting everyone from farms to consumers. The dairy industry is now navigating a complex network of rejected exports, overflowing storage, and declining prices, revealing just how tightly interwoven trade, logistics, and domestic markets truly are. For consumers, it may look like cheap cheese on the shelves, but for the industry, it's a stark signal of a system under strain, where every link, from farm to retail, is being tested to its limits. From a shopper's perspective, the sudden influx of discounted cheese and dairy might seem like a win. Shelves are stocked with affordable butter and cheese, and flashy shock sale signs create the impression of a great deal. But the reality behind these markdowns is far more troubling. Much of this dairy is near expiration, previously rejected by international buyers, and has been returned to the United States because it couldn't compete under Canada's tariffs. Consumers are unknowingly purchasing products that were considered surplus or even commercial waste, with no labeling or warning about origin, quality, or age. This lack of transparency raises questions about safety, product standards, and trust in the food system. Beyond the immediate health concerns, the hidden cost is also economic. By absorbing excess supply at lower prices, American consumers are indirectly subsidizing the losses of farmers, distributors, and retailers struggling to manage rejected shipments. In essence, shoppers are becoming the unintended endpoint of a trade dispute, bearing consequences they never signed up for. This illustrates a deeper issue. When trade policies, tariffs, and quota systems intersect, it's not just businesses and governments that feel the impact. Everyday people, walking through supermarket aisles, also become participants in a larger economic and systemic problem. Understanding this helps connect the dots between international trade actions and the products that actually reach kitchen tables, highlighting that even small purchases can carry the hidden weight of a global trade conflict. While American farmers and consumers struggle with the fallout, the White House has remained largely silent. Despite emergency letters from industry boards pleading for intervention, no concrete relief packages or policy adjustments have been announced. There have been vague statements and reassurances, but honestly, no actionable steps to address the billions in losses or the collapsing supply chain. This lack of response has left the industry scrambling, forcing farms, distributors, and retailers to absorb the financial and logistical shock on their own. The silence raises serious questions about leadership and crisis management. Is the administration underestimating the scope of the problem, or prioritizing political considerations over the welfare of American agriculture? The absence of immediate action contrasts sharply with the decisiveness of Canada, which implemented a 300% tariff without hesitation. In effect, the U.S. government's inaction has amplified the crisis, leaving small and medium-sized farms exposed and consumers caught in the crossfire. This situation really underscores that trade disputes aren't just abstract policy debates. They have real-world consequences that require timely government intervention to prevent long-term damage to an essential industry. The U.S. dairy crisis isn't just a domestic problem. It's sending ripples across the globe. Countries like the European Union, Japan, and Australia are closely monitoring how Washington handles rejected exports and domestic supply chain issues. Reports indicate that the EU alone has placed over $72 billion worth of American exports, including cheese and other dairy products, on a potential retaliatory tariff list if the U.S. fails to adjust its trade practices. These developments signal that U.S. trade partners are growing concerned about dumping, quality standards, and market disruptions. If the situation isn't addressed, the U.S. could face broader trade isolation, not just from Canada, but from longtime allies who are now questioning the reliability and competitiveness of American agricultural exports. What began as a single quota breach has evolved into an international scrutiny test, where domestic mismanagement can have long-lasting global consequences. For American farmers, this means that the stakes are no longer limited to North America. The ability to export safely and profitably to the world hinges on how quickly and effectively the government responds. The crisis has moved beyond borders, transforming a national dairy problem into a diplomatic and trade challenge with real economic implications. This crisis is about far more than cheese, butter, or milk. It's about food sovereignty, trust, and the integrity of the national supply chain. When products are rejected internationally and then dumped back into domestic markets, it erodes consumer confidence. People begin to question whether the food on their tables is safe, fresh, or ethically produced. Beyond immediate financial losses for farmers and distributors, the incident highlights how fragile the system can be when trade disputes, tariffs, and policy gaps intersect. The situation also raises broader societal questions. Should Americans unknowingly bear the cost of international trade conflicts? Can the government ensure transparency and safety when crises strike? At its core, the dairy issue symbolizes a test of national resilience, the ability to maintain a secure, reliable food supply even under external pressures. It's a reminder that trade policy isn't just a line on a spreadsheet. It directly impacts families, livelihoods, and public trust. If the administration fails to act decisively, the damage won't be measured solely in dollars, but in public confidence, credibility, and the long-term stability of a sector that has fed generations. The journey of this crisis is clear. U.S. dairy exports exceeded Canada's quota, triggering a 300% tariff that turned shipments into commercial waste. Returned products flooded domestic markets, driving down prices and forcing farmers to dump milk, while warehouses and cold storage overflowed. Consumers unknowingly became the endpoint for rejected goods, and the White House remained largely silent as losses mounted. The ripple effects extend internationally, with allies like the EU, Japan, and Australia watching closely, threatening potential retaliatory measures. This is more than a trade dispute. It's a test of national food security, trust in governance, and the resilience of American agriculture. Every family affected, every farm struggling, and every supermarket with discounted stock is part of a larger story about how policy, trade, and oversight intersect in real life. The question now is urgent. Will Washington act decisively to stabilize the industry, or will continued inaction erode trust and threaten long-term stability? For viewers, staying informed is essential. Subscribe to Deep State and turn on notifications to follow every development in this unfolding crisis. Because the fate of American dairy and the broader lessons about trade, transparency, and accountability will affect us all. This isn't just about cheese. It's about understanding how global policies touch lives at every level and why paying attention matters now more than ever.